Meanwhile, Nancy Pelosi was on Hillary Clinton's podcast. Now, I just learned that Hillary Clinton has a podcast, apparently. I don't know who would sit down and listen to a Hillary Clinton podcast, of all things, but I guess some people do. At least Nancy Pelosi does. And she was on the podcast talking about many things, but really focusing on the trauma that people in Congress suffered on January 6th during the riots. Let's listen to that.
I, as an American, am incredibly grateful for your steadiness and your devotion to our democracy. How are you holding up?
Well, first, let me just say I was very much looking forward to being with you. The kind words that you say, I accept on behalf of my House Democratic Caucus colleagues. They've been so courageous, so steadfast, so patriotic, so committed to their oath of office. And they said at that point that they were storming the Capitol and the security just whisked away. Well, it was stunning. But again, they are protective. And I thought, well, okay, yeah, I'll go with you because it's your job to make sure that I do. And I don't want to endanger anybody else. And I'm a target, So when we got in the car, I said, well, where are we going? Like to another room? No, we're going to an undisclosed location.
When I hear talk of the trauma that, and they haven't stopped talking about how traumatic it was for them, this whole experience. But whenever I hear this, my mind, I go back to a story that you may have forgotten about, or you may not have heard at all, because it wasn't exactly something that the mainstream media was eager to report. But just one example, you go back to the riots throughout the summer, and so many, just you have your pick of the litter. You can pick so many examples of traumatic things that regular American citizens suffered. And people like Nancy Pelosi never said a word about that, never spoke a word about the trauma of people who live in these cities that have been racked by rioting. The businesses burned down, family members killed. I don't know, the family members of David Dorn, for example. Nancy Pelosi ever say anything about that, the trauma they're suffering? But my mind goes back to one particular incident. The Chicago Ronald McDonald House Cancer Center for Children. During the rioting in Chicago, which there was rioting all throughout the summer, right? During the BLM rioting, the cancer center was attacked by rioters. Okay, yes, they attacked a cancer center for children. And there were kids inside, there were families inside, and they were terrified because they're listening to the windows being smashed downstairs. Now just imagine that for a second. I mean, imagine you're a child and you're sick with cancer and then you hear this commotion outside, these unruly crowds. You hear the windows being smashed in your building. Imagine you're a parent of a child going through that. There was one young child, and we talked about this at the time. So maybe if you've been listening to this show, you heard about this at least. One young child, Owen, I believe was his name, 2 years old, fighting stage 4 cancer, and he was supposed to go home to sell it for his birthday party that day. And he couldn't go home. He missed his birthday party. Now they celebrated it later, but he missed his birthday party that day because of the rioting outside. It was unsafe to leave the building. So I don't know. When I think about trauma that people suffered, emotional trauma that they suffered during rioting, I am much, much more concerned about those kids and many other children too affected by it. But even just that one case, I'm more concerned about their emotional trauma. Think about the emotional trauma they are suffering. That's something that they're going to remember in their nightmares, probably for the rest of their lives. I'm a lot more concerned about that than I am about the trauma, the emotional trauma of grown adults, powerful people, politicians in Congress. That's just me. I certainly reject the idea that we're supposed to be more concerned about that, about their trauma, the politicians. And what happened to them was so much worse. It was desecrating sacred ground and sacred people, apparently.